He never thought it would come to this. At 74, Harold sat alone one night, overwhelmed by a strange emptiness. Not sadness, not even loneliness in the traditional sense. Just a quiet realization that something essential had gone missing. It happened after an ordinary moment, one he'd repeated thousands of times, but this time, something felt different. It wasn't guilt or shame, nor was it physical pain. It was something deeper, the aching sense that a part of him had quietly faded, and he hadn't even noticed it slipping away. That night, Harold didn't just feel old, he felt erased, and he didn't know why. My name is Dr. Edward. For over 30 years, I've worked with thousands of older adults, men and women alike, helping them restore their energy, strengthen their bodies, and maintain mental clarity and resilience at every stage of later life. But what I'm about to share with you today is something I rarely get the chance to say out loud, because very few people want to talk about it, especially after a certain age, especially when it comes to men. I'm talking about masturbation, not in the way society jokes about it, not as a punchline, but as a real, complex, and deeply misunderstood part of aging. And more specifically, I want to share with you 5 crucial truths, lessons I've learned from working with men over 60 who thought they were simply aging, when in fact, they were quietly losing something far more intimate, their connection with themselves. The first truth is one that almost every man I've worked with discovers too late. Your erection isn't the whole story anymore. And that's not a problem. It's an invitation. Most men grow up believing that sexual worth is tied to performance. Hardness equals health. Duration equals power. If things don't work the way they used to, it must mean something is broken. But the truth is, the body evolves. What used to be automatic now takes time. What used to be about action now asks for presence. And in that presence, something new can emerge. I remember a patient named Malcolm, 69 years old, who broke down during our session. "Doc, I don't feel like a man anymore," he said. But as we talked, he realized that intimacy wasn't about what his body could do, but how he could connect. It was never gone. It just changed shape. And once he stopped measuring himself against the past, he began rediscovering pleasure in ways he never had before. The second truth is even more subtle. Masturbation is not just physical, it's emotional, psychological, and deeply neurological. For many older men, self-touch becomes a kind of emotional regulator, a quiet ritual to soothe restlessness or unease. I've met veterans, retirees, and widowers who don't realize that what they're reaching for late at night isn't just physical relief. It's a memory, a moment of peace, a way to feel grounded in a world that sometimes moves too fast and forgets the quiet needs of those who've lived through decades. One man, Thomas, shared that after his wife passed, he continued touching himself not for lust but for sleep, for comfort. And only after we spoke did he understand that this act wasn't a habit to hide, but a way his body was asking for connection. Without that awareness, what begins as comfort can slip into numbness. But with awareness, it becomes healing. The third truth is one I wish every man could hear by the time he turns 60. The phrase, "use it or lose it," isn't just a cliche. It's biology. When you stop engaging with your body sexually, whether out of shame, grief, or simply forgetting, your body starts to forget too. Blood flow slows, nerves become dull, the tissues lose elasticity, and what once was vibrant begins to feel distant. I once worked with Alan, a 76-year-old man who had been celibate for over a decade after his divorce. When he met someone new, he was excited but terrified to discover that his body no longer responded. He thought something was wrong with him, but the truth was simpler and more hopeful. With gentle practice, care, and patience, he began to wake his body up again. It wasn't overnight, but it was real, and it reminded him that aliveness can return, even after years of silence. The fourth truth is a warning, and perhaps the most urgent of all. The rise of digital stimulation, especially pornography, has created a quiet crisis for older men. In my practice, I've seen countless patients who no longer feel aroused by real life. Their imaginations have dulled. Their desire for real connection has faded, and they don't know why. The culprit is overstimulation. The brain, like any organ, adapts. When it receives high doses of artificial input, it becomes desensitized. What once felt thrilling now feels flat, and worse, it becomes harder to return to the simplicity of genuine human intimacy. One man, George, had spent years relying on videos each night to feel something, anything. But when he tried to connect with a real partner again, he found himself disconnected, unresponsive, emotionally distant. With time and commitment, he detoxed. He turned to memory, breath, and sensation, and slowly, he began to feel again. This process is not just possible, it's necessary. The final truth is the one least discussed, even in medical circles. Masturbation, when practiced with presence, can be a lifeline, not just a source of pleasure, but a vital act of self-respect. It keeps blood flowing. It supports the prostate. It eases sleep. It fights off the dark fog of loneliness that too many older men carry quietly. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds you that you are still here, still feeling, still deserving. I worked with a man named Walter, 80 years old, who told me he hadn't touched himself in over 6 years. Not because he didn't want to, but because he thought it wasn't allowed, that it was childish, shameful, inappropriate. After our conversations, he began again, gently, curiously, not to arouse, but to reclaim. And he told me, through tears, I didn't realize I was allowed to still be alive. This is what I want you to take away. Aging doesn't mean disappearing. Desire doesn't vanish with time. And your relationship with your body is not something to mourn, but something to reintroduce yourself to. You don't need to be young to feel. You just need to remember that you still can. What you do with that truth, well, that's entirely up to you. There was one moment that stayed with me for years. A man named Leonard, 81 years old, once came into my office with trembling hands, not from illness, but from the weight of something unspoken. He sat down, looked me in the eye, and said, "Doctor, do I still have the right to want?" That single question unraveled decades of silence in just a few words. It cut deeper than any lab result, any scan, any symptom. It was the voice of a man who had lived through war, loss, retirement, and the fading of his name in family conversations. Yet in all those years, no one had ever told him that longing was still allowed, that the need for closeness, for touch, for feeling something real in your own body was not something to be ashamed of, but to honor. What Leonard needed wasn't a prescription. He needed permission. He needed to be seen, not as an old man with outdated urges, but as a human being whose body still whispered truths no one else could hear. So we talked. We didn't speak of sex as function or dysfunction. We spoke of touch as a form of remembering, of arousal as a connection to aliveness. We spoke of shame like an old coat that no longer fit. And slowly, Leonard began to see himself not through the eyes of age, but through the eyes of presence. This is what so many older men have been robbed of, the language to describe their inner world. They know how to fix things, build things, endure things, but they were never taught how to listen inwardly when their body changes. They were never told that softness can be strength, and that seeking intimacy, even if alone, is an act of courage, not weakness. We live in a world that prepares men for work and war, but not for tenderness after 70. And so, they hide. They disappear into habits, into silence, into beliefs that this part of them has expired. But it hasn't. It's only waiting to be rediscovered. I once told a group of retired men during a wellness seminar, if your hand can still hold a tool, it can still hold love. They laughed at first, then one man wept. He said no one had ever spoken to him that way, that he thought self-touch was a sign that he had no one else, when really, it could be a way to stay in contact with himself. He had spent years avoiding the mirror, flinching at the sight of his changing body. But from that day on, he promised to see his skin as a map of survival, not of decay. That's what awareness does. It turns ritual into reverence. We are not here just to live longer. We are here to live wider, deeper, more connected. If you, reading this now, have ever felt like your desire is an inconvenience, let me say this: it is not. It is a signal that your soul is still very much awake, that you are still a vessel of sensation, of memory, of presence. There is no age where that becomes irrelevant. The shame is not in the act. The shame is in the silence that keeps you from understanding it. You may be alone. You may have lost someone. You may feel like the parts of you that once lit up have gone dim. But here's the truth no one tells you. They can return, not through performance, not through pills, but through gentle, honest reintroduction, through slowing down, through noticing what stirs within you when no one is watching, through giving yourself the dignity of curiosity. This is not just about masturbation. This is about remembering you are alive, that your body, even now, is worthy of care, that intimacy begins with how we treat ourselves when no one else is around. It begins with choosing to feel instead of fade. And that choice, even made quietly in the privacy of your own room, can echo through every part of your life. That's the secret no one teaches, but it's the one that matters most. In the quiet corners of aging, many men find themselves asking questions they never thought they'd have to ask, not because they are unsure of their bodies, but because the world has never made space for those questions to exist. One of the most common and heartbreaking things I hear from my older male patients is this: "Doctor, why do I feel invisible?" It doesn't come from vanity. It comes from years of walking through rooms where eyes no longer meet theirs, from conversations where they're spoken to like children or passed over like furniture. That invisibility seeps into how they see themselves, and perhaps nowhere does it show up more profoundly than in their sexuality. You see, when a man begins to feel invisible to others, he often begins to feel invisible to himself. He stops tending to the parts of his life that once brought him joy, including his body. He begins to believe that pleasure is a relic of the past, that self-touch is no longer appropriate, that the private world of desire has an expiration date. But those beliefs are learned, not true, and unlearning them is not just liberating, it's life-saving. One evening, I spoke with a man named Carlos. He was 78, a former school principal, proud father, and widower of 7 years. "I feel like my hands don't know me anymore," he said. He wasn't referring to arthritis or age. He meant something much deeper. He had stopped touching himself after his wife passed, not out of grief alone, but because he believed that to continue would be a betrayal of her memory. He believed that if he found comfort in his own body, it somehow erased the love they had shared. But over time, what he discovered through reflection and therapy was that honoring her memory didn't mean he had to dishonor himself. We talked about how the body remembers things the mind forgets, that our nervous system holds on to the rhythm of intimacy, the imprint of comfort, the map of arousal, and just because we age doesn't mean that map disappears. It simply needs a gentler navigator. Carlos began to touch again, not with urgency, but with reverence. He cried the first time he allowed himself that space, not because of shame, but because he realized he hadn't lost his capacity for feeling. He had only misplaced it in grief. There is no handbook for this phase of life. No one tells men how to navigate the intersection of memory, mortality, and desire. But here is what I want every man to know. Your body is not something that betrays you with age. It's something that asks for your attention in new ways. The goal is not to replicate youth. The goal is to be present with what's still alive inside you. Pleasure in later life doesn't roar. It hums. And if you're too busy judging it, you'll miss its invitation. That hum may come in the form of a memory, a gentle sensation, a flicker of curiosity in the silence of your own room. You don't need anyone's permission to follow it. You only need your own presence. And if you've read this far, you already have it. You are not invisible. You are still wired for connection. And even in solitude, you can rediscover the spark that lets you feel deeply, fully, and human again. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. Let this be your reminder. Your body is not past its prime. It is present in its power. If only you dare to meet it again. Sometimes, the most powerful healing doesn't come from medicine, but from being told the truth, gently, respectfully, and without judgment. One of the hardest truths I've had to share with men in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s is this. If you don't tend to your inner fire, it will quietly burn out, not because you are weak, but because all fires, even the ones inside us, need oxygen. I once met a man named Samuel, a retired jazz musician with a soul full of melody, but a body that had gone silent. He hadn't touched himself in over a decade, not because he didn't feel the urge, but because he had convinced himself that sexuality no longer belonged to him. He said, "I play music for others, but I stopped playing for myself." That sentence echoed in me for days, because it wasn't just about physical touch. It was about the permission to still feel wonder, joy, intimacy alone. When Samuel began his journey back to himself, he did it like a man learning a new instrument, slowly, curiously, without the need to impress. He approached his body the way he once approached a piano, noticing what each note meant, what each pause carried. And through that process, he rediscovered not only his capacity for pleasure, but his belief in aliveness. He later told me, "I thought aging meant fading, but I was wrong. It meant listening more closely." That is what this conversation is really about. It's not about technique. It's not about frequency or function. It's about remembrance. It's about reclaiming the parts of you that never died. They only went quiet, waiting for your return. Touch, when done with awareness, becomes language, a form of saying to yourself, "I am still here. I am still worthy. I still belong to this world." You see, sexuality in older men is not about performance. It is about presence. The pressure to perform fades, and what's left is something far more profound. The ability to be with oneself fully, without shame, without distraction, just honesty. And in that honesty, something beautiful awakens. That's why I say this is more than just 5 secrets. It's a remembering of your body, your identity, your right to feel, and your right to feel good. Because when an older man begins to believe that he is allowed to enjoy his body, something in him stands taller. He doesn't need permission from society, or from outdated beliefs, or from the ghosts of his youth. He only needs to look inward and say, "I am still worthy of pleasure, of touch, of joy." If you've carried doubt, shame, or silence around this part of your life, let this be your moment to set it down. There is no expiration date on intimacy. There is no age limit to self-respect. And there is no shame in honoring the quiet places inside you that still long to be touched, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. So, to every man reading this, you are not broken. You are evolving. And within that evolution is the opportunity to experience yourself more deeply than ever before. Hold that truth close. Let it guide your hands. Let it open your heart. Let it remind you that even in solitude, you are never truly alone. This is your body. This is your time. And no matter your age, you still have the right to feel fully, deeply, and completely alive.